right. How does that look?
Looks great.
Okay. Oops. Okay, so as Marnie said, my name's Carrie Brown. I am in Fairfield County, so I am located in Lancaster, so just southeast of Columbus. But the topic that we're going to talk about today is transferable to wherever you are. So we're going to talk about invasive species, specifically those that are not yet on the invasive species list, meaning they're not regulated by the state of Ohio. And we're going to talk about the early detection of those species and how we can start looking out for them now and noting their distribution. So we're going to start with just a quick review of what is an invasive species, how do they get here, where do they come from, and why are we so concerned about them. We're going to take a look at the list of the 63 plants that are considered invasive to the state of Ohio by the Ohio Department of Agriculture. How are new plants assessed for invasiveness? What plant species should we be keeping an eye on right now? I picked about a dozen. There's definitely a lot more out there, but because of time restraints, we're going to look at 12 that I think are more widely distributed. How do we report invasive species sightings? So we can't really start tackling those invasive species until we know where they are. And then finally, I'm going to share some resources on where we can find more information. So I wanted to start with just a few definitions because I think some of these words get thrown around a lot. So when we talk about a native species, we're talking about a species that occurs naturally within an area. And when we think about, when we're talking about generally, meaning that it was present prior to European contact. So there can be multiple definitions for native species, but for today's purposes, that's how we're going to describe it. There's also these three words, non-native, introduced, and established. So non-native, opposite of native. So species that does not occur naturally in a specified area. Introduced, species brought to a new geographic area, either intentionally or unintentionally by us. And we're going to talk about some of the means as which that happens. And established. So these are species that have a self-sustaining and reproducing population without human intervention, meaning that we don't have to plan it. It is escaping and misbehaving all by itself. So a lot of the plants, like as I look out my window here, may be, especially like within the ornamental trade, are non-native, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're established because we have to plant them in order to get them where they are. And then finally, if we put those three words together, we get the definition for invasive. So an invasive species, it's established, meaning that it is reproducing without our intervention. It's non-native, so it isn't naturally occurring within an area, and it's been introduced. So it had to get in that area by some sort of human activity, as well as it causing harm to the economy, environment, and or human well-being. So the two things that characteristics that are criteria that must be met. So when you have to have an organism living outside of its native or natural range. So a plant such as poison ivy, for instance, could not be considered invasive because it may be aggressive, and in some environments it definitely is aggressive, but it is native to this area. So it is growing within its native range. Alternatively, many of the plants in the nursery trade may be living outside of their natural range, but they're not spreading rapidly to the detriment of other species. So that's the other criteria that needs to be met. They're not staying put, they're escaping, and they are competing or outcompeting the native species within those environments. And where do they come from? They come from, they are introduced through a combination of intentional and unintentional introductions by us humans. Unintentional introductions could include hitchhikers and shipping ballast water or through contaminated goods. For instance, spotted lanternfly, which a lot of you may be intimately familiar with, was thought to have been introduced on some dryscaping materials that were shipped here as an egg mass. Intentional introductions often involve species brought in for agriculture, horticulture, culinary purposes. In the case of animals, maybe pets. And we're going to learn with a lot of these species, there's a lag period before their invasive, kind of true invasive colors are shown. And during that lag period, they aren't causing a lot of harm in the environment, or we don't see them causing a lot of harm in the environment. The bottom right picture that you see, I took from a brochure that the USDA put out, I believe in the 50s. Some of you may be familiar with multiflora rose. So multiflora rose is a regulated invasive species, meaning that it is illegal to buy, sell, or plant multiflora rose. But before we realized that, it was marketed as a living fence for agriculture, because if you have dealt with multiflora rose, it's not something you want to walk through. Livestock doesn't want to walk through it as well. So it's kind of like hindsight is 20/20. But some of these were introduced with good intentions before we realized the true repercussions of those introductions. Once they're here, their dispersal is aided by natural processes such as wind and water, dispersal by animals such as birds eating fruit and dispersing the seeds, and through hitchhikers, whether that be seeds hitchhiking on clothing, shoes, and other equipment that is used by people when we're traveling between locations. And why do we care? So what do these invasive species do? They can compete with existing stands for nutrients and water. Our understory plants often take a pretty big hit from these species. A lot of these species are able to exist when we're talking about a woodland setting, able to exist in very dense shade. Therefore, they are shading out anything that is underneath them, anything on the forest floor that would depend on that, on the light that would normally be able to make it through the canopy. Reduce or eliminate forest regeneration. So when we do have an area that is timbered, for instance, or cut or burned, a lot of times those invasive species are the first things to show up, rather than some of the invasive species that we may be hoping will fill in those areas. They can disrupt relationships within the ecosystem, and we're going to take a look at a specific example of that later on with Japanese barberry, which is a plant that you see covering the forest floor here. Sometimes they can introduce disease. That disease can then affect the native species within that same genus. And they can cause economic damage by impacting agriculture, fisheries, and infrastructure. Once again, going back to spotted lanternfly, so much emphasis is being put on stopping the spread or slowing the spread of spotted lanternfly because of the impact it can have on specialty crops such as orchards and vineyards. So talking about those understory plants, when we look at native wildflowers, native fungi, regenerating forest floor, in this type of setting, they're not going to stand much of a chance. So a lot of those things are just going to get pushed out pretty quickly when we have some of these species introduced that are able to then form a monoculture. So what is it that makes an invasive invasive? So how do they affect their environment? And the answer is they exhibit multiple invasive characteristics. So and we're going to look at a list, and I'd say just about all cases, there are multiple characteristics that they're exhibiting from this list. Kind of like to refer to these as tools in the invasive tool belt. Species can exhibit traits such as extended growing season. So a lot of times, especially if you have a woodland or if you are driving along the highway in the spring, the first thing that you start to green up, that you see start to green up, are things like bush honeysuckle or multiflora rose. So they get a head start on photosynthesis. A lot of our other plants are still sleeping, are still dormant, whereas these are getting a kind of a head start. They're able to start producing energy and storing that energy and becoming an even stronger plant. Adaptable to a variety environment. So while some of these plants would prefer to live in loamy, well-drained soils, like what seems like most of our plants, they will also live in areas that are dry, or they may not mind to have their feet wet for a while. So they're able to be a little bit more adaptable than some of our native species that have more specific requirements for growth. Allelopathic properties, meaning that they release chemicals into the environment that will inhibit the growth of other plants. Ailanthus, or tree of heaven, is an example of this. Bush honeysuckle as well. Rapid growth and reproduction. So many of these species, because of that extended growing season perhaps, they grow quickly and they reach sexual maturity very quickly, meaning that they are producing flowers and fruit before some of those native species. I know that autumn olive, for instance, when I was out in the woods this year, kind of paying attention to the phenology of the invasive species compared to the surrounding native species, the black walnuts had hardly broken bud, and at the same point that the autumn olive was already starting to flower. So rapid growth and reproduction, they can get that fruit out there quickly. A lot of times high seed production. I think bush honeysuckle is a good example of this. Bush honeysuckle, when it produces fruit, it produces a lot of fruit. And if you were to take one of those fruit and break it down, you would see that there's multiple seeds in each fruit. Of course, our birds will disperse that, but unfortunately, bush honeysuckle is kind of like junk food for birds. It doesn't have a lot of nutrition for birds, but birds will eat it because it's present and it's red and it's signaling that it is ready to be eaten. Another example of this that you might be familiar with is garlic mustard. So a single garlic mustard plant can produce up to 8,000 seeds. And those seeds can remain viable in the soil for several years. Multiple means of reproduction. So some of these species will flower and produce seed, but at the same time, they're able to reproduce through vegetative means, whether that be rhizomes or tubers. Effective seed dispersal mechanisms. So they have different ways that they are able to get around. And then lack of natural controls. So the mechanisms that keep the species in check in its native range aren't present in the areas in which it's introduced and established. And because those checks and balances aren't present, that's part of what allows it to be able to have this growth that allows it to outcompete some of the native plants that do have those natural controls in check. So Section 901.5 of the Ohio Revised Code designates these 63 species as invasive plants in the state of Ohio. This list was last updated in February 2023. So of the 63 plants that you see on the screen, the ones with asterisks are the species that were added when it was last updated. Prior to that, it had been updated in 2018. The Director of Agriculture has sole and exclusive authority to regulate invasive plant species in the state, including the identification of invasive plant species and establishment of prohibited activities regarding them. And this is straight from the Revised Code. The Revised Code states that no person shall sell, offer for sale, propagate, distribute, import, or intentionally cause the dissemination of any invasive plant. So on this, these 63 species, selling, planting, distributing is against the law within the state of Ohio for these species. Ohio also has a list of noxious weeds. Noxious weeds are plants that can injure agricultural crops and livestock due to their invasiveness, toxicity, and other harmful characteristics. And they can also negatively affect people and ecosystems. Like most states, Ohio has an established process for minimizing the negative impacts of noxious weeds, and there are actually laws that require their management and eradication at certain points within the calendar year. Of course, once a plant species is introduced, it can take some time for invasive characteristics to be widely recognized. And really one of the issues with invasive species is the amount of time it takes for these newly introduced species to be added to watch lists or control lists. And a lot of times by the time this is accomplished, the situation has turned from preventative to more reactive. I think this is a great publication. It aims to provide a heads up to what may be up and coming. And really that's the purpose of this guide, is to help landowners and land managers recognize plants with invasive tendencies that are not widely distributed, so that they can be treated rapidly and hopefully eradicated rather than becoming a large and expensive problem. This was released in January of 2018. It covers several states, including the state of Ohio. And I think this passage does a nice job of summing up the purpose of the guide. Not all newly introduced species become invasive. Those which do often follow an invasive pattern, meaning that they remain at low levels for several years or decades. And we talked about that as the lag phase. And then they enter a phase where they increase dramatically. So those populations just kind of start booming. Attempting to control large invasive plant infestations is a costly endeavor. And it is much more cost-effective to allocate resources toward invasive plant prevention or the rapid treatment of new introductions. Unfortunately, the process of adding newly introduced species to watch lists or control lists is frequently tedious and lengthy. And by the time many invasive species are on the radar, they have become widely established. So just taking a peek inside this publication, this is a sample of the table of contents, and you'll likely recognize many species on here, including Coosa dogwood, paper mulberry, daffodils, butterfly bush. And it's important to remember that not all species listed here are going to be problematic in all portions of the region, because this is a publication that covers 20 states. It just means that the species has escaped cultivation in some part of that northeast/north central region. And a sample of the information that's provided. This is a species that we are going to be talking about today, Amur cork tree. You can see that it has good photos that can be used for identification, along with growth traits, lookalikes, where you're likely to find it, where it's listed as a noxious weed, as well as more information about its introduction. So I was kind of wondering, how did they determine what species to add to this publication? And they explain it within the notes of the publication. So they combine the noxious weed watch and a new invader list within that 20-state region. They considered the species with the highest ecological impact ratings. Looked at species that are not yet widespread, and then also elicited the opinions of numerous state and regional invasive plant experts. And speaking of those invasive plant experts, you may be familiar with OIPC, the Ohio Invasive Plant Council. OIPC is a coalition of agencies, organizations, and individuals throughout Ohio that are concerned about the introduction, spread, and control of invasive non-native plants in Ohio's natural habitat. They promote public awareness of invasive species issues and encourages land management and research to detect invasive species and prevent new invasions in natural ecosystems. And they have created an assessment protocol that they use within their assessment working group, which is composed of representatives from across Ohio, from academia, land management, the nursery industry, government agencies, to use scientific data to revise the list of invasive plants within the state of Ohio. And like I said earlier, though the Director of Agriculture has exclusive authority to regulate plant species within the state, they depend on experts to make recommendations. So OIPC continues to be engaged in discussions of this legislation and related issues of regulating invasive plants within the state of Ohio. So to conduct the assessment of a plant, the team scores the plant on a number of criteria. I have those criteria listed up here on the slide. So these are the different things that they are considering. Ultimately, they score each plant on a scale from 0 to 85. And you can see that breakdown on the bottom of the slide. So a score in between 45 and 85 is deemed invasive by Ohio Invasive Plant Council, and so on. This is a screenshot of the full assessment results. So if you visit their website at www.oipc.info, you can see the full assessment results. So it gives you the species, the score, the date in which it was assessed, and in some cases, species are reassessed, along with the scoring. So you can actually see which of those criteria are exactly what of those criteria are causing that organism to be scored as invasive or not invasive. Everything that you see with an asterisk there is already on Ohio's regulated invasive species list, meaning that it is illegal to buy, sell, or plant those species. Now, two of the factors that they use to calculate the assessment depend on sightings of the plant. And because a committee of 5 can't be everywhere at once, they utilize a variety of observation databases, including one called EdMaps. EdMaps is a web-based mapping system for documenting invasive species and pest distribution. You can kind of think of this as iNaturalist, but it's a little bit more beefed up. It is specific to invasive species. It was launched in 2005 by the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health at the University of Georgia. And it serves as a platform for casual observers to document invasive species and pest sightings. So through EdMaps, participants can submit their observations. They can view results through interactive inquiries, and they can maintain their personal records and visualize data with interactive maps. Now, all submitted observations are verified by professionals. So, for instance, Kathy Smith gets quite a bit of the observations that are submitted in order to verify that it is indeed the species that is being reported. And then that data is made freely available to everyone. So scientists, researchers, land managers, this is a database that can be freely accessed. EdMaps, they aggregate their data from other databases and organizations such as GLEDN. So GLEDN is the Great Lakes Early Detection Network. Basically, the observations that you submit to GLEDN are then fed to EdMaps. So they will make their way to EdMaps. And we'll take a closer look at GLEDN before the end of this presentation. One other thing that I wanted to mention is we know that plants and animals, they don't pay attention to state lines. So as a result, it can be helpful to also take a look at what other states are dealing with. There are varying levels of invasive plant regulating within the country. So there are some states that regulate invasive plants more than others. There are states that don't regulate invasive plants, meaning that they may have an invasive plant list, but there are no laws that are restricting the use of those plants. So taking a look at what other states are dealing with can be helpful, especially those states that surround Ohio. All right, so on to the main event. I wanted to preface this with a couple thoughts. So not everything that I'm listing is necessarily going to be an issue in your area. So we learned that before the presentation started that we have folks here from all over the state, all over the country. So keep that in mind. Some of the distributions are quite spotty, but I'm mentioning them because they are showing invasive tendencies, and in certain locations, especially with changing climatic conditions, their range could be expanding. So it's important to keep an eye out for them. I include the distribution map for each species created from EdMaps. So the EdMap map for each of these species is going to be on the bottom right portion of the slide. And remember, these maps, they rely on observations recorded by Good Samaritans like you and me. So it's likely that the map is just a snapshot of their occurrences, and their actual reach could be more extensive than what we see on the map. And I've also included OIPC's assessment score. Remember, their designation is not regulatory. In order for the plant to be banned from the state of Ohio, it has to be deemed as such by the Director of Agriculture, but they do take recommendations from councils such as OIPC. And finally, this list is by no means complete. There's certainly species exhibiting invasive characteristics that aren't in this presentation, but for the sake of time, I had to narrow it down to just a few. I chose them based on OIPC's invasive assessment scoring. I also included a couple species that were most recently added to the Ohio's regulatory invasive species list that may not be on your radar. And then also by talking to professionals that are out there that are, what is it that they are seeing escaping into natural areas. And we're going to start in no particular order with Amur cork tree. So Amur cork tree was introduced in the 1850s as a yard tree, as a shade tree, a specimen tree. It has a broad spreading crown. Oftentimes this was found in parks, golf courses, parking lots, and it has shown to escape cultivation in parts of northeastern United States, and is invading and displacing native hardwood forests, especially on the fringes of urban and suburban fringe forests, which makes sense because that is oftentimes where these landscape trees are planted. And as you can see, it scored a 45 on OIPC's invasive assessment, which puts it just in that invasive category. Medium-sized tree, it has a short trunk with broad, round, spreading crown. The species is dioecious, so that means that there are separate trees that produce male flowers and separate trees that produce female flowers. So obviously the fruit is only going to be produced on the trees that produce female flowers. So those are the ones that are going to, I guess, be invasive because they are producing the fruit that is going to be dispersed by birds. But in order for that fruit to be produced, you do need male trees. You need a pollen parent as well. So the leaves are opposite. They're compound, 10 to 15 inches long. And if you crush them, they have a smell that's like turpentine. The bark is distinctive. It's thick and corky. It's attractive. So it's actually kind of part of its winter appeal. And the inner bark is bright yellow. Flowers really aren't anything to write home about. Small clusters, the male and female flowers look very similar, but the females are the only ones that are going to produce fruit. So these fruits are produced in clusters. They're pea-sized. They start out as green and they ripen to black and can persist well into the winter. So we can see that thick, corky bark. Part of the reason that it's been popular in ornamental plantings, I think, And that inner bark is bright yellow, very distinctive, but of course that's not something that you're going to see from the outside. That is something that you would have to dig into the inner bark in order to see. The leaves look very similar to some of our native plants. So seeming that these are oppositely, the leaves are oppositely arranged, I think it could be confused with ash or maybe even box elder, with also has oppositely arranged leaves. But the fruit itself is very distinctive. So it looks nothing like ash or box elder fruit. And there's that fruit as we go into the fall. It's starting to mature and darken, and then it will persist on those trees even into the wintertime. Wineberry. So this is a rubus. So this is a non-native raspberry species. It was introduced as breeding stock for new raspberry cultivars in the 1890s. This species can form extensive, dense thickets that will displace native vegetation, and they will shade out things that on the forest floor that rely on the filtered light from the canopy. They are able to, they're quite adaptable. They can live in quite a few different locations. I know that oftentimes I find these along forest edges, and just from my observation, they seem to be locally aggressive. This is not something I see here and there, but in areas where it's established, it can form very dense stands along those woodland edges. And of course, it's something that should not be planted. It's multi-stemmed. It is spiny. It is kind of grows as a small shrub. Like other raspberry species, it has canes. These canes have small prickles, and the entire plant is covered with these minute reddish hairs, which we'll see some photos. It's very distinctive. The leaves are alternate. They are compound with 3 leaflets that are toothed, and the underside of these leaflets is hairy. The flowers are small, 5-petaled. They develop in May through June. The sepals that are on the outside of the petals are hairy, and they're longer than the petals. So it almost gives the appearance of these flowers looking like they haven't opened yet. The fruit looks like a raspberry. So clustered, juicy, and bright, very red in color, ripening from June to July. And this species has 2 means of reproduction. One is through seed. So this is by mainly by birds dispersing seed, as well as layering, which is when the one of the canes touches the ground, then it is able to then root from that stem, from that cane, and then produce a clone of that plant. So you can see the 3 hairs there, the serrated leaves, very spiny. And this is something that I think because of those reddish hairs, you can spot this from pretty far out, especially if you see its growth habit. You know it's a species of rubus. These hairs really set it apart from our native species. You can see the flowers there, those long sepals that are quite hairy as well, and then the production of those fruit that look like a raspberry. I mean, they are a raspberry. They're a species of rubus. All right, next up is periwinkle. Periwinkle is not a newcomer. This is a species that has been around for a while, but it is not regulated. So it's not on the Ohio's invasive species list. It was introduced in the 1700s as a ground cover, and it's still commonly sold as an ornamental ground cover. It inhabits open to shady sites, including forests, and often escapes from old home sites. So a lot of times I feel like I see this in woodlands that aren't very far from a landscape that planted this at one time or another. It grows very quickly. It forms a dense mat and is able to displace both herbaceous and woody natives as a result. And you can see I went ahead and threw the entire United States map on there just to show that this is something that is, it's not something that we're the only ones dealing with here in the Midwest and North Central part of the country. The western part of the country is dealing with this as well. So it's a trailing ground cover, mostly evergreen. It has slender stems, so it's not going to drop its leaves in the winter, which is one of the reasons that it continues to be popular within the ornamental trade, is it gives you that winter color. The leaves are opposite. They're dark green. They're glossy. In some cases, they may be variegated. The flowers can be blue, lavender, or white. Doesn't typically fruit, but it is instead getting around vegetatively through rhizomes. So it's creeping along. So if you spent any time at all within a wooded area, I would imagine this is something that you have come across. I think that it can commonly be confused with winter creeper, which is in the genus Euonymus. Winter creeper has slightly toothed leaves, and it has the potential of climbing trees. Whereas in most cases, periwinkle is going to be a ground trailing plant, so it's going to creep along the ground rather than climbing. And here's some of those variegated varieties that you might see out there. And they do come, you might see, typically it is going to be that blue color, but you might see that these in a variety of kind of lavender or even white. All right, next up is Japanese barberry. So this is another one that is not new to the scene, but it is not on the Ohio's regulated list, so I wanted to make sure I mention it. If you look at that map there, you're going to see that this is a plant that has really gotten around. It was introduced as an ornamental in the 1800s. It is very shade tolerant, especially for a woody shrub. It occurs in shaded woodlands to open fields to wetlands, so it's very adaptable to different habitats. It has a very dense growth pattern, and we're going to see that that in itself has implications. Common barberry is listed as a regulated invasive species in Ohio, so it is illegal to buy, plant, or sell common barberry. Common barberry, you can see there, is toothed. Its spines exist in threes, whereas the spines on the Japanese barberry are in single along the twig of the plant. Those leaves are kind of more paddle shaped, and they are not toothed. It's a small shrub, 3 to 6 inches tall, but it has a very dense, compact growing pattern. We saw those leaves. Those leaves are paddle shaped. They're quite small, so up to 1 inch in length. It is dioecious, so it drops those leaves in the wintertime. The bark is grooved. It has these short, straight spines. The flowers are pale yellow. They droop in clusters, so a lot of times if you're not looking for them, you're not going to see them. But they do flower mid-spring to early summer. The fruit ripens to bright red, and it is able to spread via rhizomes as well as birds dispersing that fruit. And this is a plant that is widely cultivated. It comes in an assortment of colors and sizes, and more than likely found at a McDonald's or a doctor's office landscape near you. It is very prevalent. The problem is that many of these cultivars are still able to produce fruit heavily, and when the seed is distributed or dispersed into natural areas, they can revert back to their original green color and create issues within the understory. You can see here a well-established population of Japanese barberry. on the left, and an up-close picture of what those leaves look like, and those grooved stems, and you can see the flowers there. Eventually, those flowers will mature into these red fruits, and a lot of times those will persist on the plant even into the dormant season. I wanted to throw this in here. It's an example of how invasives can impact native ecosystems in ways that we may not think about. Because of its dense growth habits, Japanese barberry creates this almost like microhabitat that is ideal for rodent species, including the white-footed mouse. And that's the little guy that you see here. The white-footed mouse is the main natural reservoir for Lyme disease. So ticks that feed on these mice, which is going to be immature ticks, the larvae or the nymphs, become infected, and then they're capable of transmitting Lyme disease to mammals that serve as hosts, and that, of course, includes people. So additionally, these protected human microclimates that are produced by Japanese barberry, it's ideal habitats for ticks when they're not consuming a blood meal. So this further increases the chance of Lyme disease being present in an area. Of course, the black-legged tick, also known as the deer tick, same species, two common names, is considered a serious pest in Ohio. And it's becoming more common in the past decade, especially in wooded areas, which is their preferred habitat, has the potential of transmitting multiple diseases, with Lyme disease being one of the most serious and recognized illnesses. And these are guys that, especially with some of the winters that we've had in the last few years, they never hunker down completely for the winter. So if we get a warm day in December, in January, 40, 50 degrees, then these guys are going to come out, and we may see, we may be able to, we might find ticks on ourselves that time of year. So a time of year when we may not really think of as tick season. So really, we kind of see a domino effect with this. So we have increased populations of barberry that's going to harbor more rodents, who harbor more ticks, who harbor and transmit more Lyme disease. So, and that's in the case of these deer ticks. And there are studies that have shown that a reduction in Japanese barberry populations has resulted in a decrease in instances of Lyme disease. All right, next up is winged burning bush. So winged burning bush was introduced in the 1800s as an ornamental. I would say that this is just as common as Japanese barberry, if not more common. And really, despite its invasive nature, it remains a very popular landscape plant. So it is still legal to buy, sell, or plant winged burning bush. It has shown to invade those both disturbed and, most concerningly, undisturbed areas. And oftentimes you're going to find this on forest edges, old fields, and roads. Looking at the map there, this is something that Ohio is not the only one dealing with this escaping landscapes into natural areas. And it did score quite high on OIPC's invasive assessment. So this shrub is dense, compact. That's why it makes a good hedge. So that is part of the reason that it has been so popular within the ornamental industry. The leaves are opposite. They're dark green, but they turn bright crimson to purple in the fall, and that's where it gets its common named burning bush. The bark is kind of quirky, especially the newer growth has these quirky ridges that form along the length of the stem. The flowers are pretty inconspicuous, but it does tend to produce a lot of fruit. This fruit ripens in the fall. Reddish capsules will split open to reveal the orange fleshy seeds that are inside. So while this shrub does indeed have curb appeal, I will give you that, unfortunately, it doesn't always stay put. And many times, I think one doesn't realize the degree of spread of this plant until the fall, because that's when burning bush shows its true colors. I took this photograph in Lancaster across the street from from my road actually. And I would say that during the growing season, I might just assume that that is um, maybe bush honeysuckle. Bush honeysuckle is so prevalent, but in the fall season, you can see that this is indeed winged burning bush. It really stands out. During the rest of the season, it is green in color. You can see there on the left, and then that brilliant crimson color, and those ridged twigs, quirky ridged twigs that you see on the right. The flowers are pretty small, pretty easy to miss. And you can see the fruit there, those capsules that peel back to reveal the seeds. The next one that I wanted to mention is Norway maple. Norway maple has been a popular tree along streets and on lawns because of its hardiness. So it is very adaptable to different soil types. It produces a lot of seed, and those are now found invading forests and forest edges. So it is found to be established, meaning that it is reproducing without human intervention. I think the main concern with this plant is it has very large leaves, and very large leaves produce a lot of shade. That really makes it hard for plants to grow underneath it. So oftentimes it will shade out those understory plants that we talked about. And like I mentioned, it's very well adapted to extreme soil types. So medium-sized tree, 40 to 60 inches tall, very large leaves that provide dense shade. The leaves are usually green, but there are some cultivars that have dark red or purple leaves. We'll take a look on one of the upcoming slides to compare it to a sugar maple leaf, which does look similar, but it tends to have more lobes than a sugar maple leaf. And it's broader than it is high, as well as the leaf petioles. So that's the stem that connects the leaf to the twig. When broken, will exude a white sap. The bark is grayish, regularly and shallowly grooved, and the flowers are green-yellow. For a maple, they're quite showy. So in the spring, I think that these flowers really do stand out when a lot of other things are still dormant. And of course, they will produce winged fruit called samaras, as other maples do. But the difference with these samaras is their wings reach out to nearly 180-degree angle, which you can see here on the left. So those wings are kind of straight out, whereas the sugar maple that you see on the right are not nearly as angled. Then you can also see that white sap on the petiole of the leaf of Norway maples. The leaves are very wide, and like we talked about on that other slide, they can have more lobes than a sugar maple. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Of course, when we're identifying anything, it's always good practice to look at multiple specimens. But I think the wideness of that leaf, the fact that it's broader than it is long, is pretty distinctive for Norway maple, especially in comparison to some of our native maple species. And then there's that crimson color that oftentimes you see in landscapes. There's those flowers in the spring. The buds on Norway maple are quite large, especially compared to buds of our native maple. And then those flowers can be quite showy. Next up is air potato. So honestly, this is not one that I am too familiar with, but it is something that's being found more and more in Appalachian regions and in southern Ohio. This was introduced in Asia in the 1800s for culinary and ornamental purposes. It is a vine, and it is able to form dense masses and kill native vegetation, including trees, so it can suffocate trees. It occurs in a variety of disturbed moist habitats, and it has a variety of means of reproduction. So it can spread by seed, it can spread by tubers in the ground, and then it can also spread by bulbils, which are small tubers that are found in the leaf axils. So it has many common names: air potato, Chinese yam, or cinnamon vine. It is herbaceous. It's a twining vine, so it spreads by wrapping around. The leaves are alternates, but they can become opposite as they advance up the vine. So looking at leaf arrangement may not be the best means of identifying the species. There can be a lot of variation in the shape of the leaf. The stems are thin, they're wiry. The flowers, occasionally small white flowers. So it's maybe a species that you don't always see flower. And that's because it has other means of getting around. So while it can reproduce by seed, it can reproduce by tubers as well. And those tubers that are in ground can be quite big, from 2 to 3 inches in length, or 2 to 3 feet in length, rather. And you can see here, these are those bulbils. So those are those aerial tubers that are found in the leaf axils. Each one of these, once it falls off the plant, is then able to produce a new plant. So that's one of the means of this getting around. Plus, it's a vine, so it's able to go distances because it's able to travel and twine around existing vegetation. And there's an up close of those tubers. All right, sawtooth oak, another one I wanted to mention. So Quercus actissima. So this is a non-native oak. It is native to Asia. It's been widely planted here in the U.S. as an ornamental and especially as a food source for wildlife. It produces an abundant amount of acorns. It is adaptable to a wide range of soils. It's tolerant of heat and humidity, which, looking outside, we have a lot of that here in Ohio. Like other oaks, it does prefer full sun. And it has been shown to escape from urban settings into natural areas, including forests. And it's able to hybridize with native oak species. So our oak species tend to be promiscuous, and that includes this sawtooth oak as well. It's a medium-sized tree. It has a broad, spreading, rounded crown like many of our oaks. The bark is gray to black, and it develops corky ridging as it ages. The leaves are chestnut-like, so if you're familiar with a chestnut oak, those leaves do look similar, but they tend to be narrower, so less wide, but maybe still the same, some of the same length. It has bristly teeth along the margin, so this is in the red oak group, has those bristle tips. Flowers in mid to late spring, and produces acorns like our other oaks. These acorns, it can be a very prolific producer of acorns. And you can see there that corky bark on the left, and those bristle tips that line the margin of the leaf on the right. So similar to that of a chestnut or a chestnut oak. The caps of the acorns are very burry, I guess, very hairy, and I think resemble that of an overcup oak or maybe even a bur oak. But you can see that they do are produced in very large clusters, and the acorn itself is chestnut brown in color. Next up is butterfly bush. So butterfly bush, I know that this one is maybe a little bit of a controversial one because this is also prized by many as a nectar plant. But I did want to throw it in there because it is shown to escape into natural areas and to cause competition with native plants. It was introduced from Asia around 1900 as an ornamental. It establishes in sunny, dry, disturbed sites, but it has also been found along stream banks, so it does prefer more well-drained sites. Now, it is an abundant nectar source for adult butterflies, so I will give the plant that. But the problem with butterfly bush, and really all of the species that we've mentioned, is they are not a host plant for our butterfly caterpillar, our caterpillars of our Lepidoptera species. So in order for our Lepidoptera species to complete their life cycle and become butterflies, they have to have a food source. And their food source is the plants that they co-evolved with. Our species of Lepidoptera did not co-evolve with butterfly bush because butterfly bush is an introduced species. So as such, it's not a host species for any of our caterpillars. So though it is a food source for adult caterpillars, it's not giving anything back to that larval state like our native plants are. In addition, it can replace other plants as a nectar source, and that can reduce the native plant pollination. So those plants that are host plants for Lepidoptera may experience reduced pollination rates in the presence of butterfly bush. So this is a shrub, has arching stems. It tends to be a pretty fast-growing plant. There's lots of cultivars out there. It's very prevalent in gardens. The leaves are opposite, 6 to 10 inches long, with toothed or wavy margins. The flowers are dense, they're clusters, and they are fragrant. They have a long flowering period, May to August, depending on the cultivar. Like we mentioned earlier, they do produce high quantities of nectar, and they're very attractive to butterflies and other pollinators. The fruit, I think, oftentimes can go overlooked. It's not readily available or visible through the remnants of the flower, but the seeds are very small, dust-like particles that are easily dispersed by the wind. So here we can see some escaped butterfly bush. So it is established, meaning it's not planted in these areas, has those opposite leaves, those tubular, fragrant flowers, and then we can see the seed pods there. The next two species are new additions to Ohio's regulated invasive species list. So meaning they are banned in the state. So these are regulated, but I still wanted to make sure that they're on your radar because I think that especially in the case of white mulberry, it's a plant that can kind of hide in plain sight. So Morus alba is our non-native mulberry species. It's been here for a long time though. So it was introduced in the 1600s. And if you look at the state or the entire country, you're going to see that it's gotten around. So this is a plant that is very adaptable to different habitat types. Mulberry, white mulberry, it's an important cash crop and medicinal plant that's been cultivated for silkworms for more than 5,000 years in China, where it is native. So it is native in China. Kind of an interesting introductory story. So in 1624, the legislature of Virginia required every male resident to plant at least 4 white mulberry trees to promote a North American silk industry. So that was the goal. By the 1830s, the potential for a silk industry prompted a horticulture phenomenon known as mulberry mania in the eastern United States. But by the late 1830s, white mulberry plantations in the Northeast were killed by especially cold winters. And in the South, they were killed by disease. And that kind of put a stop to mulberry mania. However, evidently, there were many survivors as this species has continued to spread across the country and is established in each of the 48, the lower 48 states. It poses an ecological threat not only for displacing native species, but it also, there's a possibility that it can hybridize with and also transmit a fungal root rot disease to our native mulberry. So that is Morus rubra or red mulberry. Morus alba, so white mulberry, is similar to in what it looks like compared to our native red mulberry. but it can be distinguished by its leaves. So white mulberry, which is our invasive mulberry, have leaves that have glossy surfaces, whereas the leaves of our native red mulberry are not glossy and they're kind of rough in texture. And this is a species that can grow in many different areas, so very adaptable. It's a small to medium-sized tree. The leaves are alternates, like we said with the white mulberry, they're shiny, and there is a ton of variation in shape of white mulberry. What's going on over here? I'm sorry. It can be lobed, but it can also be entire. So there is a lot of different, a lot of variation in the leaf itself. The bark is shallowly furrowed, has long, narrow ridges. It kind of has an orangish hue, I think, especially when the tree is young. The fruit develops in midsummer. It's multi-seeded, and it can ripen to black, purple, or white. And the roots are wide, spreading with both a taproot and lateral roots. So you can see the bark there, and then on the right, you can see some variation in the leaf. So we do have just some lobing here, and in some cases, that lobing can be much deeper. So kind of all over the place when it comes to leaf shape. This plant is dioecious, so like the Amur cork tree, there are separate plants that produce female flowers and separate plants that produce male flowers. So on the left, you see those male catkins, so that is the pollen. And then on the right, we see the female flowers that's developing into fruit. The fruit is then distributed by birds. It is also edible. This tree can be quite messy, so it's not really a great species to have hanging over your driveway, for instance. Princess tree. So this is another species that is on Ohio's regulated invasive species list. But I think that it can commonly, especially from afar, be confused with catalpa. So catalpa is also a kind of a weedy tree species. It's not regulated, whereas princess tree is. Another common name for princess tree is empress tree. It was introduced from China in the 1840s as an ornamental. It is tolerant of infertile and acidic soils and drought conditions. You can see that it is very well established in the southern states, so southeastern states within the US. But we also are starting to see establishments of this within the state, especially the southern part of Ohio. It is an aggressive grower, so it is able to grow very quickly, and it can produce an abundant amount of root shoots. So if you have ever tried to take out an ailanthus or a tree of heaven, for instance, I know that a saying that that always has stuck with me is if you cut down a tree of heaven, 100 will come to its funeral. And that's just because you are ticking that plant off just by cutting it. And it responds by sending up root shoots. And then you have to deal with each of those root shoots individually. This has a similar tendency. So medium-sized tree, like we said, rapidly growing up to 15 feet per year. The bark is gray-brown, rough. I think as it matures, it kind of resembles the bark of tree of heaven, so lighter colored, shallow vertical fissures. The twigs are stout, brown, and speckled with white dots, which are the lenticels. So the lenticels are quite visible. The leaves are opposite. They are large. They can be very large. And because of that, they can produce dense shade. They have very showy flowers. So they're tubular, they're fragrant, and they tend to bloom before they leaf out. And they can produce a ridiculous amount of seed. So it produces these woody capsules with these tiny little winged-borne seeds, winged seeds, up to 2,000 per capsule. So that gives you an idea of what the bark looks like on the left. Very, very large leaves that you see there on the right. You can kind of see how this might be confused with catalpa. This is a photo that I found on iNaturalist. It was taken in Kentucky. And I think that this really drives home the point of how large these are and how much shade this plant can produce, because these are oak leaves. Look how tiny these oak leaves look compared to the leaf of the princess tree. Now, the size of these leaves I don't know is typical, but it does have the ability to produce very large leaves that can result in a lot of shade. And leaves that are growing off of root sprouts have been measured up to 2 feet in length. You can see those very showy flowers there on the left. And there's those capsules on the right. So you can see last year's capsules, which are larger. Most of these have already split. And these are this year's capsules that are forming. All right, and the last species that I wanted to cover is hybrid crabapple. So this species is, we're still kind of figuring this out, but it is a species that is being documented. Its establishment is being documented in undisturbed forests and dense shade, which is always a cause for concern. The genetics are still a little bit in question, though there is some work being done on this. It's thought to be hybridized Chinese, Japanese, and Siberian crabapples. The great majority of malus species are European and Asian in origin. Of course, crabapples were introduced to North America as ornamental trees and as rootstock, so they have been here for a while, but they're showing to escape cultivation to woodland borders. They will hybridize with each other and can be abundant in an assortment of habitats. In some cases, they can grow very thick and produce impenetrable thickets, and they can produce a lot of fruit. And this fruit and seed is dispersed by birds and mammals, and it's also able to reproduce vegetatively by suckering. These can be difficult to identify because as a hybrid, there's a lot of variation in leaf shape, fruit color, and so on. And these hybrids can, be a result of obviously non-native species, but perhaps native species as well. Here's some photos of those hybrid crabapple species. So can have different colors. So these are kind of hard to identify just by looking at them. Really, that's why genetic work is being done. The fruit can be different shapes or different sizes and different colors. And then I thought this was odd. Here's 2 different colors existing on the same twig. So still some questions behind this hybrid crabapple, but it is cause for concern because it's starting to show up in areas that aren't right adjacent to suburbanized or urban areas, meaning that this is a plant that is it has a wider spread than maybe we realized just a few years ago. So something to be on the lookout for. When we think about managing invasive plants, really that's a whole other webinar in itself. So there are some things to consider. Choosing the appropriate herbicide application method is important. So whether that be foliar, basal bark, cut stump, or hack and squirt. So there are going to be different times of year that is appropriate for each of these. Some species, for instance, with basal bark treatment is going to be most effective on species that have a smooth bark. So sawtooth oak, for instance, has a really thick, corky bark. That would not be an appropriate application method for that. So considering the species, the time of year is important, and of course the herbicide as well. The label is law, so read the label. The label is going to tell you the rate. It's going to tell you the time of year. It's going to tell you the plants that are able to be controlled with that chemical. Of course, consider the time of year. Monitor the site, so don't forget about seed banks. So we talked about a lot of plants here that produce a ton of seed. And in many cases, that seed is able to stay viable for multiple years, meaning that if it doesn't germinate right away, it's able to just kind of hang out until conditions are right, and then it's able to germinate. So a lot of times, if you reduce the competition by removing a lot of those parent plants, well, you're just providing space and light and resources that their progeny are able to then take advantage of. So it's important to go back and monitor that site after the removal of invasive species, and then also looking for potential resprouts from that parent plant. Of course, prevention is the #1 control. Invasive species, they can be really good hitchhikers. So remember to check your clothing, your shoes, your equipment, and even pets for seed when you're leaving areas with infestations. Prevent populations from going to seed in the first place and adding to the seed bank, making it harder for future years to get rid of that plant. And to help prevent the spread of harmful forest pests in the state, avoid traveling with firewood. Instead, buy local and burn local. Now, we can't prevent the spread of an invasive species if we don't know its current distribution. So GLEDN, which is something that I mentioned earlier, the Great Lakes Early Detection Network, this is a free app that is available for iPhones and for Androids. It allows you to report what you see, and you're able to also then check out those ed maps and see where the species has been reported in the past. So just a few screenshots from that app. Once you log in, you're able to access an assortment of information. If I click on all species, I'm able to see a full list of all species available for reporting. So what makes this different than something like iNaturalist is it has a bank of species for you to choose from. Not everything's going to be in there. Sugar maple, for instance, is not an invasive species. Within the Great Lakes area, it's native. So it's not a species that you're going to report on. The only species that you're going to report on are the species that are causing issues within the Great Lakes. And that list is updated as needed when there are new species that are causing concern. So from here, you're able to look at the entire list of species, and you'll notice that this is not just plants. This also includes insects and other animals as well. You can search, and you can see there on the right. And then from there, I really like this. There's a lot of information here right in the palm of your hand. So info, there's some information on what that species looks like. There's an assortment of images from bugwood, and then the map. So that's where you can zoom in to see where positive identifications of the species have been made throughout the area. If you want to report a species, you go to report an observation, and from here, it will record your location, and then you indicate information such as time spent looking for that species, the status, whether it's positive, treated, or not found. So negative reports in many cases are just as important as positive reports. So knowing where it is not is also good information. So that's something that you can record. If you do have a positive sighting, meaning that you believe there is an infestation, you're going to indicate the area and density. There's also room for other notes, and then you're going to save it. If you happen to be offline, it will upload once you have service again and you reopen that app. And then, like I said earlier, that information is then sent to Woodland professionals in order to verify your sightings. And then at that point, it will be listed on EdMaps once it's verified. Some different resources that might come in handy. Like I said, I didn't have time to go into a lot of detail on management today. The Woodland Stewards website does have some good fact sheets though. So if you go to publications and click on forestry, scroll down, you're going to find an assortment of fact sheets for some of our more common invasive species. Those fact sheets include information on identification, but also very specific information on treatment methods as well. Ohio Invasive Plant Council. So this is the site that I referred to earlier that provides recommendations on plants that should be added to the invasive species list and goes through that assessment. And that can be accessed at oipc.info. If you go to invasive list, there's also an assortment of fact sheets that are really good. So they have great photos that can be used for identification. And then there are also details on management as well. And then if you go to alternatives, a lot of times we get questions on, okay, I want to take this out, but what should I replace it with? And there's some suggestions there on alternatives that you can replace some of those invasive species with. And with that, I will, I guess, open it up for questions.
Okay, Carrie, we've got quite a few. I answered some, but I left you a good number.
All right, I'll see what I can do.
Great presentation, and I think that as always, when we talk about non-native invasives, it opens up more questions. And I think that it's, you know, like you said, you picked some of them that aren't currently on the state list. And I think that's wise because we were having the discussion this morning that because it's invasive in Pennsylvania and it's invasive in Indiana, the odds are is that it's here and something that we're gonna have to deal with at some point in time, but our population may not be where it is in some of the other states. So let's see here. So Kathleen asked, and I was going to try to dig into this, but I don't have a good answer, I think, but I'll leave you see. We have a large Siberian elm that we cannot afford to have removed, so it continues to make seeds. Any ideas on what we can do about it? I mean, the only thing, you like things like Florel and that you can spray, but that becomes expensive.
I'm assuming that if it's in an area that has structures around it or roads or driveways, then it's definitely not something that you would want to just hack and squirt or basal bark treatment and allow it to die. But if that is the case, if it is an area where it's not in danger of falling on anything, that could be an option, is to pursue one of those treatments and allow it to just kind of die over a couple of years.
Yeah, just so you're protecting whatever.
Yeah. When it's located in an area that where it is in danger of falling on things, and that definitely gets a lot trickier. And I understand that tree removal can be quite expensive. I recently had to have some trees removed, so definitely not cheap.
And the bigger they get, the more expensive they are.
Yeah, they
do. Susan asks, why was glossy buckthorn removed from the Ohio invasive plant list?
I don't know that I know the answer to that.
So I was trying to think. I remember that discussion when it happened, but I too don't know if I remember what the bottom line was when it was removed from the list. I do remember it was a hefty discussion amongst a bunch of us about why, but the thought process behind doesn't stick with me. That would be someone from Invasive Plant Council that should take a look. Laura says, why isn't Japanese barberry on the ODA list of invasives?
I knew this question was coming. all I can tell you is that the Director of Agriculture has sole and exclusive authority to regulate invasive plant species in the state. So they are the ones that make the final call, and for whatever reason, that species has not been added to the regulated list.
Yep. Are Japanese barberry / white-footed mouse present in Japan? And do they have an elevated number of Lyme disease cases in that region of the world?
That is a great question. I do not know the prevalence of Lyme disease. It could be that there are other reservoirs, other rodents that serve as reservoirs, other than the white-footed mouse. But yeah, I don't know. That would be a good question for Tim McDermott. Tim McDermott is our tick expert.
And somebody ask about the reporting for ticks, and I did put that in the chat, the link to the website.
That's a great new tool that we have.
Deborah says, I can tell you why the Japanese barberry is not on the list. You do not want to open that can of worms, Deborah says. So we won't go there. Laura asks, why so few observations of Norway maple in Ohio compared to our neighbors? Yeah,
that's a great question. Like I mentioned earlier, EdMaps depends on people that are looking for it, people that can positively identify it, and people then who take the time to actually record it within that system. So because of that, I don't know if it may be like a more of like a promotion of that species being an issue in some of the neighboring states. I don't know off the top of my head if Norway maple is regulated in any of those states, but it could be that there's more of an emphasis put on its presence, and because of that, that results in more sightings being recorded. That would be my best guess.
So as you get to the Northeast and more of a maple syrup production area, they are having issues with Norway maple outdoing or outpacing sugar maple in sugar bushes. So where it is such a huge industry, there's definitely more of a focus on identifying and eliminating Norway maple. And I don't know that that's been quite the focus in Ohio. So that's one aspect of it that I'm aware of. Mary says, how can we eliminate invasive so they will not grow back? I've had several cut down, but they are regrowing.
Yeah, so it's kind of an ongoing battle, right? I think, I know personally with me, I have a few acres of woods, and I try to, prioritize. And I think it's important not to bite off more than you can chew. And a lot of times with those invasive species, especially those woody species, you can't just cut them down and go, because they have, if they're established, they have a, energy buildup in that root system, and they're going to come back. And in some cases, when they come back, they can cause an even a larger population than what they had to begin with. Like, for instance, with the tree of heaven, cut down a tree of heaven, 100 will come to its funeral. So I think before removing invasive species, do some research as of what's the best way to get rid of those species. If you want to use a method such as cut stump treatment, that is going to be more appropriate later in the season when the plant is starting to take things down into its root system, then I know that what I have done in the past is, if I see a bush honeysuckle and I don't want it to produce another year's of fruit, I'll go ahead and cut it high in the spring, and then and flag it, and then come back later and give it a fresh cut and treat it, or treat with something oil-based that doesn't require a fresh cut. But yeah, keeping it from producing more seed, I think, is important as well. And then just continuing to monitor, knowing that there is likely a seed bank. I think providing competition as well. So inputting some things into that area, those alternatives. in order to hopefully outcompete that species and keep it from coming back like gangbusters.
Okay. Laura asked, does the nursery industry acknowledge the lag period in invasiveness when they continue to introduce new species?
I do not know. I'm not sure what the thought process is behind that. And the lag period in many cases, I think, can vary quite a bit. And a lot of times I don't know that we are able to really calculate what the exact lag period is, because sometimes these things are spreading and we don't realize it, or it isn't recognized by the people that can actually regulate it and make an impact that way. So
I think sometimes some become acknowledged invasive faster because they were more heavily planted. So I think you can look at calorie pair that way, in that it had all these perfect features as street trees and things like that. So there were so many of them that were planted. It became kind of a it tree to plant. And I think that also slows down that, or makes it shorter, I guess I would say, from point A to point B, just because of the mass numbers that you have out and about. And I've been in on a lot of discussions on the pair issue, and that's usually what most of the folks come back around to. Yeah, so Mary was talking about they've been cut in areas where she can't grind out stumps. So and Carrie's right, you need to treat the stumps so they don't sprout back, and as long as that's not an issue, that's probably going to be your best option. Kathleen wants to know, are air potatoes edible?
As a representative of OSU Extension, I never promote the eating anything. But I do know that one of the reasons it was introduced was for culinary reasons. So I'll leave you with that.
I have a lot
I
of
do not know for sure.
Get introduced for culinary. Will asks, how does one distinguish Chinese yam from native wild yam?
I guess that's something I would have to do a little more research on.
Yeah.
I am not sure.
Are some, Anonymous says, are some of our native plants / trees present and invasive in other countries? If so, what are a few examples?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I've often wondered. I guess off the top of my head, the only thing I can think of, I was in France a couple of years ago, and it was in May, and the black locusts were everywhere. And I knew it because they were in flower. You could just, I mean, they were very, very prevalent. So I know black locust is one of them.
So red oak is invasive in Poland. It was, our northern red oak was taken over as part of a research project. And when I was doing some research for an oak presentation, that was one of them that I found, was that red oak there has become invasive. So we share things. It's not just one side of the ocean or the other. So Daria asks, is there any program or group looking out for the potential invasiveness of cultivars and their need for regulation?
That's a great question, Daria. That was something Kathy and I were discussing before this presentation, and in terms of how this affects cultivars. I know that last night I spent a lot of time reading the Ohio Revised Code, and I know one statement I was able to find is the Director of Agriculture may exempt a cultivar of any invasive plant species defined on the list if scientific evidence is presented that the cultivar is not invasive. So I don't know, I guess what I would read into that is that cultivars are included on the regulated list unless they are excluded, but don't quote me on that. That was just kind of based on that one statement within the revised code. I don't know off the top of my head uh, if the groups that are assessing invasive species, if they are also assessing individual cultivars. I want to say that Bell's, Kathy, what's the Bell's showy bells?
Showy fly, Bell's honeysuckle, which is the Tartarian Marrow hybrid.
I want to say that
sold.
I want to say I saw that on OIPC's assessment list. So that, I guess, would be a cultivar.
Yeah, yeah, because it was sold in the nursery, even though it's a natural cross of two non-natives. But and it's one that's kind of those spotty. I mean, I can show you a bunch of it here, but I don't see it everywhere. So it definitely has some hot pockets as far as in the state. So Cindy asks, are there different varieties of burning bush or all the winged, or are they all winged burning bush?
There's multiple cultivars. So there's lots of cultivars out there. They're all the same species though. And there's cultivars that are selected by shape. I know that through research, I saw that there are some cultivars that claim to be sterile or produce very little flowers, which results in very little fruit. But, you know, if you've ever heard of the calorie pear story, those were intended to be sterile at first as well, but nature seems to find a way. That being said, yeah, there are lots of cultivars out there, and there may be some that are pose less of a threat because they produce less fruit. I also know that I've heard one of our horticultural educators talk about using pruning as a means of restricting fruit production. So pruning burning bush during the time of year when it's flowering, that way it can't produce any seed in the fall. So that could be a way to have your burning bush, but make sure that it's not producing progeny that's going to escape.
Great. So Laura says some people worry about the presence of butterweed and dogbane because they're aggressive natives. Do you recommend control of those species?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the case of some of those native aggressive species, there's definitely a place for still controlling those species. And it really just kind of just depends on the time and place. Like butterweed, for instance, is toxic to livestock. You don't want it in your hay. So that is something that a farmer who is, growing a pasture is going to want to restrict from their pasture. So, and I think the same for dogbane as well. So I think there's definitely a time and place to restrict those, even if they are native.
I'll just jump in, at least on the dogbane side of things, as I just was in a discussion with some professionals on that. We have it taking over a very small pollinator plot on the OSU Mansfield campus, and had that very same discussion. Like, yes, it's native, it's providing resources, so it's a great pollinator for plant for bees. Bees were all over it. It also retains structure, so it can be really good nesting and winter cover habitat for birds. So I think it also just goes back to your objectives and what you want to do with the area. And just if diversity is something that you're into, then maybe beat it back a little bit. And from what we learned, it's difficult to control without some sort of chemical control. So yeah.
Okay. So Anonymous says, in urban areas away from woodlands, is it as important to remove invasives? Looking out my window at my neighbor's butterfly bush in Columbus.
Yeah, that's also a question that we get a lot, I feel like.
That seed source in the woods comes from somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, like, for instance, Columbus Metro Parks deals a lot with like calorie pear. Those calorie pears escaped from areas that are more urbanized and suburbanized. So, yeah, I don't think being in that location necessarily excludes you from, thinking about your plant choices.
I think that's, I mean, in my case, I have burning bush coming up in the woods. I don't have any burning bush in my landscape, but my neighbor does. And as I teased Marnie before we got started, is that her birds don't stay over there after they eat the fruit. They come over to my woods and leave me the fruit. So pear is the same way. They started as street trees, and all that fruit, it has to go somewhere when it goes through them. So let's see here. Persicaria virginiana taking over my yard. Is that considered invasive?
I believe that's jumpweed.
Is that what that is?
Jump seed. Yes. Well, in terms of designation, it is native. So because of that, it can't be called an invasive species, but I will give you that it can be quite aggressive. Yeah.
I think that I have this discussion with woodland owners on the whole native aggressive, and it's where I have really tried to draw a line between that. It's native, it doesn't make it invasive, it makes it an aggressive native plant, and leave the invasive terminology to the non-natives. But sometimes you just have the site that's perfect for that native, right? And it just grows well and takes over. So it's not an easy one to answer. If it's more plants than what you want, then I guess you have to get rid of it. John says, I discovered dog rose on our property in southern Preble County last year. It hadn't been reported from Preble previously. How widespread is this species in Ohio? I don't know.
So I just pulled up EdMaps.
Did you?
More widespread than I realized, honestly. It has been reported in Preble County a couple times. John, maybe one of those is your reporting, but it seems to have a pretty wide distribution, central Ohio and northern Ohio. But as I look through all of these, I don't know that it's been reported more than 2 times in each of those counties. So it's kind of the tricky part about distribution is we don't know how prevalent it is there without with just this little bit of data. So
Kim says, is girdling the base of a tree a way of killing invasives?
Yeah, it definitely can be as long as it's done properly. I know that if you just you want to remove a section of bark if possible. If you're just girdling it with just a single cut, that vascular tissue can regrow and it can survive. So I think that by making sure that there is a gap so that vascular tissue, that cambium layer is definitely cut, divided, then you're going to have better success of kill. Kathy, is there anything else you want to add to that?
So I just I typed in, and I can add it over in the chat, is that our updated controlling undesirable fact sheet is online, and I sent the PDF out. And so it'll talk about, girdling. And the big thing with girdling is understanding whether the tree or shrub is diffuse porous or ring porous. Because if it's diffuse porous, you need to cut deeper. So that girdle needs to go deeper in order to sever that living tissue versus, a ring porous, you just have a pretty small ring of live tissue that needs to be severed. So you'll see a little chart in that fact sheet that talks about different species and what their porosity is. But you might have to do some digging on the invasives, because I don't know that I have any good sense on those characteristics for some of our common invasive species.
And I know that we had, I think, a a handful of foresters on the webinar today, and Perry reported that girdling ailanthus and paulownia triggers root sprouting, and you will have more stems afterwards. So it's not necessarily going to be a good option for everything.
Right.
Thank you,
Right.
Perry.
Mary says, what about winter creeper? She says she was pulling it for 25 years without getting rid of it. Yeah, it needs treated.
Yeah, winter creeper, it like I said, I had to kind of narrow it down today. It could have very well have made it in the presentation. Yeah, it is another one that is not regulated.
Yeah.
I really thought it was until I looked at the list. So that I made assumptions in the past. But yeah, it's certainly out there.
And it's so sneaky. I mean, you can have kind of a core spot of it that you know is there, but if you start looking out away from it, you know, initially it starts with one small little vine that goes out and you don't notice it, especially when everything else is green. I was out with a woodland owner once who I pointed it out to him. He grabbed it and then he started following it back to where he was trying to figure out where it was coming from. And I'm like, you could be gone a long while because I don't know where it came from. But yeah, it's one that needs treated. I unfortunately have some here that needs repeated spraying in order to keep it from going everywhere. Marianne says, what sources?
It has those thick leaves, so a lot of times
that's
the
true.
herbicide just rolls off. You need a surfactant or something that's going to help it stick to those leaves.
Yeah, you want something that's going to help it stick, because otherwise, yeah, you're just throwing chemical in the ground, which doesn't really help. Marianne asks, what sources will help ID odd grasses? Don't know. Do we have a grass?
They're just kind of hard to ID in the first place. I don't know if, I mean, I think that there are lots of good extension publications out there when it comes to grasses, especially non-native invasive grasses, but knowing where to start, I think, can be tough.
I was trying to see if there was anything. Both Illinois and Cornell have a couple of fact sheets that pop up on grass ID. There's some videos here as well.
Yeah, I didn't see anything that OSU has.
I haven't seen us. I mean, there's a regional grass publication, at least there was a few years ago. But I don't think we have anything, at least nothing that pops. Let's like go to Ohio line and see if
I know that we do have a fact sheet on Japanese stiltgrass.
Definitely for forage, diseases.
Well, our pest and plant clinic, are you able to submit samples for identification there, or is it just pests and diseases?
So you used to be able to, but I haven't submitted anything. And they have the digital sample option now, so you might be able to do it that way. I'm trying to see. They don't really say. You can do an online. There's a $20 fee. So there's a form to fill out.
I think you can also just bring a sample to your local extension office. They may not have the knowledge to give you an identification right then and there, but they have access to different experts within extension that can help get you that answer. I know that I Name that plant is my favorite. I love days where I get a plant in here that I don't know, because it's an opportunity to learn a new plant. So I'd say utilize your extension.
Yeah, you can always email us. I mean, we all get photos of different things, or sometimes one of us gets something and then we share it with everybody to say, I don't know what this is, but can anyone tell me what it is? So if you've got something that you don't know what it is, just goes back to taking quality photos so that we can ID it.
Which is a class in itself, I feel like.
Yeah, I sometimes think so too. But so Deborah says, do you have fact sheets available at Extension? She lives in Fairfield County.
Yeah, so Deborah, all of those are available on Ohio Line. But if there's a fact sheet, a specific fact sheet that you're looking for, then you can stop in the office and I'd be happy to print it off for you.
So ohioline.osu.edu is where all of our fact sheets are posted. When you're looking for some of the Woodland stuff on our Woodland Stewards website, we have some stuff from other areas, other states, other agencies posted in our publication links. But yeah, ohioline.osu.edu will get you our fact sheets list. Kevin says there's a Facebook page called Midwest Grasses, Gramnoids and Sedges. Oh my, and they do a lot of IDing. So there's an option. Okay. I think we got through the questions, Carrie.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. Marnie, since you're back, I'll let you stop the recording.
Oh, yes. I was looking up the Midwest Grasses site. Thanks again, Carrie. I missed it, but I'm sure it was fabulous.